There's a difference between figurative language and literal language, but they're not a binary. You got to think about it as more of a spectrum, right? They all exist on the same spectrum, whereas one side of the spectrum is super literal and the other side is super metaphorical or figurative, right? So we're going to start on one end. We're going to start with the concept of denotation, right? So let's think of the word bear, right? Now, if we talk about the definition of bear, we could get something like this, right? This huge long description of what a bear actually is. That's one type of denotation. It's the literal description or the literal definition of whatever a word means, right? Now, depending on the type of class that you're in, a bear could also be denotatively the actual bear itself. The thing is, what they both have in common, this long description and the actual bear itself, is that they're both trying to talk about what a bear is, right? Their reality, right? That's what denotation means. What's the definition? What is the thing itself? So any word that you can give me, if you asked me to give you the denotation of it, I could give you the definition of it, or I could give you a picture of the actual object, right? So denotatively, a bear is either the bear itself or this really accurate description of a bear. So that's the literal use of a word when we're using their definitions based on what they actually are. So when we're being literal, we're using the denotation of a word. Now, when we're using connotation, what we're doing is we're thinking of all the words and ideas that people often think of when they think of a word, right? So going off our example of a bear, if we're going to think of the connotation of the word bear, we can think of all of these other ideas and words, right? The connotation of bear for me, I think of honey, I think of trout and furs and winter and claws and fang and, majestic, cuddly, powerful. I think of all these words and ideas. It's not the meaning of the word bear, but they're ideas that I think of when I hear the word bear. And that's what it means to think of something connotatively, okay? So words have both denotation and connotation. They both have a definition and they have these vibes or this odor or this, aura of other ideas, of other words that surround them when they're being used, okay? So that's denotation and connotation. So this is the starting point of when we start getting into figurative language. So we're going to go over metaphor, we're going to go over allegory, and we're going to go over symbolism, okay? So we're going to start with the easiest one, and that's metaphor. So metaphor, let's use this example. Let's think of Hannah. Let's pretend there's a person named Hannah, and then we're going to say she's X, and then we're going to say Hannah is a bear. Like whenever you call anyone a bear, that's obviously a metaphor, unless it's an actual bear, right? So what we're doing in a metaphor is we're saying X is Y, right? So if I say, so-and-so is an eagle, if I say so-and-so is a beast on the football field, right? Those are metaphors. They're not literal beasts. They're not literal monsters, right? When you say something like that test killed me, right? Well, it didn't kill you because you're telling me, right? You're just being, hyperbolic. You're using a metaphor, right? So by saying Hannah is a bear, that's inaccurate. It's a metaphor, right? But all it does is it takes this idea of the connotations of the word bear and it transfers those connotations to the person it's being compared to. We're not saying Hannah is a literal bear. We're not saying the definition of bear matches the definition of Hannah. What we're saying is the connotation of the word bear, and we're transferring it over to Hannah, this, fake person that we're using as an example, okay? So that's how a metaphor works, and you should all know this, okay? This is a basic idea in literature. So this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. So let's think of this idea of allegory. Normally when we talk about allegory, or when teachers talk about allegory, that's when a story has a lot of metaphors that are tied together, right? It's almost a one-for-one basis. So the best example that I can give you to understand what an allegory is think of a stoplight, right? In a stoplight situation, right? One color represents an idea. So red means stop, green means go, And technically, yellow is supposed to mean slow down. Now, in our culture today, yellow could mean slow down or speed up. So now it's not really allegorical anymore because it has more than one meaning. But traditionally and legally, it means slow down. Okay? So think of an allegory as an extended metaphor. It's like a network of metaphors working together, right? So let's see how that looks in story form, okay? So think of this left side is going to be a real life scenario, what it means in the real world, and then the right hand side is going to be what it might look like in a fictional form, right? It's like the allegorical representation of what the character Hannah does, right? So let's pretend Hannah's a real person, and let's pretend that someone's writing about her life story, okay? And they're going to do it in an allegory form. So Hannah, right, in the real world is just doing her thing, and then in the allegorical representation, the author would write, and so the valiant warrior, right? Then Hannah thinks of an insult because she runs across a boy she doesn't like, right? She thinks, stupid dummy head. But in an allegorical representation, the author could write, grab the magical lance. So that insult is like the lance, and Hannah is like the warrior, right? And then Hannah calling the boy a stupid dummy head and the boy crying could allegorically represent her slaying the beast, right? So in the real, let's pretend Hannah's a real person. So in the real world, she thinks of an insult. She comes across a boy, she insults him, and she cries. Oh, and the boy cries, right? In the allegorical representation, in the fictionalization of her life, the author looks at Hannah and goes, I'm going to write a beautiful story about this. She makes Hannah into a valiant warrior. She makes the insult into a magical lance, and then her insulting the boy, she turns into, a dramatic slaying of the beast. That would be an allegory, right? This section over here, because everything in here is standing in for something else that's happening in the real world, okay? And that's what an allegory is. An allegory takes a bunch of metaphors and ties them all together into one long story, okay? All right, so think of an allegory as an extended metaphor. Now, in the extended metaphor, what ends up happening is the thing that's representing the thing in the real world is going to transfer the connotations over to the thing in the real world, right? So the connotations of the slaying of the beast is now transferred to the active name calling. The connotations of the magical lance are now transferred to the insult. And the connotations of a valiant warrior are now transferred to Hannah. So what you do in an allegory is you have all these connotations being transferred to what they represent in the real world, right? So there you go. That's how allegory works, okay? And we'll talk more about it in class because that's a pretty complex idea. All right. So there it is, allegory. This is a real world example of how allegory works in the real world, and this is what it would look like in the story world, okay? All right. So remember, allegories are a series of metaphors that connect to each other in the form of a narrative, and the shared connotations of the metaphors, right? Not the denotations, the shared connotations implies if the actions and characters are positive things or negative things. All right, now let's move to the most complex thing of all, right? The idea of symbol. So let's follow along. We're going to take our character Hannah, who exists in the real world, and now we're going to put her in a fictionalized story, okay? So follow this plot overview with me in order to understand symbol. Hannah has journeyed to Alaska in search of a lost treasure that is said to grant the finder immortality, right? So she could live forever. Hannah has gone on this journey out of her lust for power, which with immortality she plans to rule the world. She has also gone out of fear. She means to prevent her own death. Right? On this journey, Hannah has to fight the Alaskan wilderness and her own personal weaknesses in order to succeed. She's almost successful, but she gives in to her desire to insult a passing bear, calling him a stupid dummy head. The bear, able to understand human speech and sensitive about his intelligence, chases Hannah, and bam, the bear eats Hannah. Let's pretend that's an actual fictional story, okay? So that bear eating Hannah is going to be a symbol, right? What's it a symbol of? What's a symbol? Well, a symbol is when a single thing, it could be a person, an action, a place, right? Something in a story, an event, right? Or a thing when it starts to represent multiple things, right? In allegory, you have one thing standing in for another thing, right? In a symbol, you have one thing that could mean multiple things, right? So in this instance of the bear eating Hannah, what could that mean? That action of the bear eating Hannah could now stand or mean all these other things, right? So that bear eating Hannah could be some sort of argument about what happens when you lust for power, right? It consumes you. It could be fear, right? Fear is like getting eaten alive, right? It hurts you and destroys you. It could be the wilderness, right? It could be nature. That bear is Mother Nature destroying Hannah. Or it could also mean the personal weaknesses of Hannah, right? Her own personal weaknesses are what ultimately destroys her. So that act in this plot, right, of this bear eating Hannah could mean lots of things. It could stand for people's lust for power. It could stand for fear. It could stand for nature. It could stand for personal weaknesses, right? So that bear is symbolic. So now that is super, super figurative, right? Meaning we're not using that bear to mean its literal definition. We're using that bear as a stand-in for a whole bunch of ideas. So assuming that this fake story I made up hints throughout the telling that each of these elements is in fact metaphorically represented by the bear, that's how bear is going to work, right? So all those connotations of those ideas are now going to be thrown upon the bear, right? So the bear eating Hannah, Hannah being eaten, they all mix and swirl together. So you can have multiple interpretations of this action, okay? So, boom. The symbolic moment could come to mean that our lust for power will consume us, or that our fears will eventually catch up to us, or that nature will not be tampered with, or our weakness will be our undoing. So, kind of like what I said earlier, okay? So, the starting point, right, is metaphor. Then it starts getting more complex with allegory, and then it gets even more complex with symbol because it can mean lots of things. But that's all based on this concept of denotation and connotation, literal language and figurative language, right? So once you know the literal, then you can start moving towards the connotative, right? And once you understand connotation, then you can really understand figurative language, things like metaphor, things like allegorical language, and things like symbol, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. I know that's a little bit complicated, but we'll talk more about it in class, all right? So high five for learning, Eagles, right? Me giving you a high five in this picture, right, is an allegorical representation of what it would mean in real life. High five is a symbolic gesture because it could mean lots of things, right? Like, I respect you, I think you did a good job, I think you're awesome. And then me calling you an eagle, it's like a metaphor. You're an eagle. Okay, so if you have any questions, please ask me, okay? High five for learning.